He worked beside Putin. What he saw, terrifying. Andrei Illarionov spent 5 years inside the Kremlin as one of Putin's top advisors. Now he's warning the world. Putin isn't just dangerous, he's obsessed with power, fueled by paranoia and dead set on reshaping the world map. Peace talks? Off the table. Compromise? Only if it serves Russia. And Ukraine? Just the beginning. So what drives Vladimir Putin? What did this former Kremlin insider witness that made him sound the alarm? In this episode of The Military Show, we're digging deep into Putin's rise, his twisted strategy, and the chilling signs that his ambition might go far beyond Ukraine. To understand Putin's thought processes about the war in Ukraine, let's take a look at his early background, particularly before he became the Russian president we know today. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, in 1952. One of the hallmarks of his early career was that of a KGB officer. This experience and expertise likely profoundly shaped his worldview and leadership approach. Former intelligence officers who worked with him, as well as Illarionov himself a bit later, describe him as a methodical, patient, and calculating individual. It's likely that at least some of these traits were nurtured during his KGB career, and they would later define his political maneuvering. Overall, if we take a look at Putin's personality, we can see several distinctive characteristics. Putin approaches challenges with a calculated, unemotional logic, assessing situations based on power dynamics rather than ideological commitments. While this might not be as visible when we look through the lens of modern-day Russian politicking in the midst of one of the biggest wars of the century, it was this calculating approach that allowed Russia to get itself into a position where it can threaten not only Ukraine, but the entirety of NATO. This was done through decades of undermining local and international authorities, particularly regarding non-aggression and bilateral agreements that Russia had signed and broken over the years, which we'll discuss later. Similarly, Putin's KGB background instilled a fundamental suspicion of others' motives, particularly those of Western powers. This is most evidenced in his belief that NATO has been aggressively posturing towards Russia, especially by giving memberships to countries that either border Russia or worse, were once a part of the Soviet Union. Among these are the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, but also Finland and to a lesser extent Poland and Romania, which were a part of the Warsaw Pact. Ukraine was simply the tipping point for Putin due to the country's especially complex ties with Russia, which Putin alluded to multiple times before and during the initial invasion in February 2022. Additionally, Putin has displayed a clear preference for authoritarian structures, even during his first few terms as the president of Russia. Perhaps one of Putin's biggest achievements is his positive relationship with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, which spans well over a decade and has positioned the two countries in something as close to an alliance as possible when considering two authoritarian nations striving for supremacy. To accomplish all this, Putin has broadened his image beyond that of a politician and a powerful ruler. He cultivated an image of physical fitness and self-control, participating in various outdoor and sports activities. This can also explain the somewhat confounding shirtless pictures of Putin circling through social media, at least during the 2000s and 2010s. The trend of using body confidence as an analog for political power was actually first used by Italian dictator Mussolini, who often stripped off his shirt to show off his physique as a conduit for his capability to lead a country of similarly strong people, at least on camera. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a history professor who specializes in authoritarianism, argues that this idea of using physical power harkens back to the era of Nazism and even goes so far as to evoke a strong feeling of toxic, overpowering, and lawless masculinity. The notion is that only a real man, like Mussolini or Putin, who followed in the philosophy's footsteps, can have anyone or anything he wants without asking for consent. While the use of masculinity in this way could be more commonly applied to people and interpersonal relationships, it's quite clear that Putin, like many other authoritarian figures from the past century, has taken it to the extreme of using it in geopolitics. This could somewhat explain Putin's extremely aggressive and expansionist views toward the former Soviet Union. To drive the point home, Russian political analyst Lilia Shevtsova once noted that Putin doesn't just rule Russia, he embodies a specific understanding of what Russia should be: strong, respected, feared, and never subservient to outside powers. We can even go so far as to see him using this ideology during the early years of Putin's role in office. By the end of the 1990s, pretty much every country that was in the Soviet Union was undergoing a severe crisis, and the dissolution of the Union didn't help matters much. This meant Putin's ascent to the presidency in 1999-2000 occurred during a period of profound instability in Russia. Previous President Boris Yeltsin's chaotic governance had left many Russians yearning for order and national pride. Putin, then a relatively unknown figure, was appointed prime minister in August 1999 and became acting president when Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned on December 31, 1999. Upon assuming office, Putin moved swiftly to consolidate power. He brought the oligarchs to heel, allowing those who accepted his authority to retain their wealth while exiling or imprisoning those who challenged him, most notably Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He centralized control over Russia's regions, replacing elected governors with presidential appointees. He systematically dismantled independent media, bringing television networks under state control. He neutralized political opposition through legal harassment, co-optation, and in some cases, violence. While it's obvious in hindsight that all these actions would end up establishing Putin as a supreme leader without opposition, since it would be dismantled summarily, Russia did end up seeing some benefits from these changes. The changes allowed the country to focus on the most significant economic and demographic issues. This period coincided with the restoration of the Russian oil and gas industry, which bounced back starting in 2001 after nearly 2 decades of decline. The Russian energy sector would eventually end up becoming one of the country's economic backbones, to the point where it might be detrimental to its actual economy. But at that time, it helped the country regain its wealth. More importantly, it allowed a select few early investors and entrepreneurs in the energy industry to get incredibly wealthy. The oligarchs would end up becoming some of Putin's most valued henchmen, as their connections to Europe through Russian gas and oil exports meant that Russia was effectively siphoning wealth away from NATO and into its own coffers. By his second term, from 2004 to 2008, Putin had established what political scientists call a managed democracy, a system with democratic institutions as facades, while real power remains concentrated in the executive. The assassination of journalist Anna Politkovskaya in 2006 and the poisoning of former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko that same year signaled a willingness to eliminate critics through extreme measures, which harkens back to his cold-blooded determination to stay in power. Putin's governance model, which would be referred to as the vertical of power, features several key elements. Chief among them is arguably state capitalism. The aforementioned energy sector was a vital industry. While the oligarchs initially had significant sway in the Russian government, Putin has slowly started to remove their power by putting their private companies under state control, a reversal of the process they underwent during Yeltsin's time in office. The renationalization allowed Putin to effectively control Russia's income, overcharging public projects involving vital companies in the energy, banking, and construction sector, with the Kremlin and various oligarchs receiving a cut of the profits. This was achieved through the second part of Putin's ruling strategy, installing people loyal to him in vital positions. He rewarded those most loyal with opportunities to go up the political food chain, so to speak. However, once there, the officials practically depended on Putin's favor, becoming no more than puppets for his intentions. The third aspect of Putin's vertical was the opposition or lack thereof. Putin didn't eliminate Russia's opposing parties overnight. He dismantled them gradually through a calculated mix of legal manipulation, repression, and intimidation. One of the most effective tools he used was altering the country's electoral laws. By raising the threshold for parties to enter the State Duma and barring candidates on minor technicalities, like alleged ties to extremism or minor paperwork errors, he narrowed the field to those who posed no real threat. The Central Election Commission, tightly controlled by the Kremlin, ensured that only approved candidates could make it onto ballots and that election results served the state's narrative. Another tactic was the creation of so-called spoiler parties, political groups that pretend to be opposition but actually support Kremlin policies. These parties were designed to split the anti-Kremlin vote and create the illusion of pluralism. At the same time, genuine opposition figures were denied access to state-controlled media, which dominated public discourse in Russia. These media channels regularly smeared opponents, painting them as foreign agents, criminals, or threats to national stability. You can see a glimpse of a similar strategy during the previous US elections. In fact, the Russian government was accused multiple times of trying to influence the US elections through smear campaigns and widespread social media trolling. Putin also leaned heavily on the legal system to suppress dissent. Laws labeling organizations as extremist or foreign agents were routinely applied to opposition groups and independent media. Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation, for example, was declared extremist, which effectively banned it and barred anyone associated with it from running for office. NGOs and independent journalists who received international funding were similarly blacklisted under foreign agent designations, making their work nearly impossible. The repression isn't just legal, it's also physical. Opposition figures have been harassed, surveilled, imprisoned, and in some cases assassinated. Boris Nemtsov, a prominent critic of Putin, was shot dead near the Kremlin in 2015. Alexei Navalny survived a 2020 assassination attempt involving the military-grade nerve agent Novichok, only to be jailed on his return to Russia, where he ultimately died in prison in 2024, according to Russian authorities. These attacks, combined with constant arrests and detentions, send a clear message: challenge Putin and you risk your life. This system delivered what many Russians wanted after the chaotic 1990s: stability and a sense of restored national dignity. The price for that was the complete dissolution of Russian democracy, at least behind the scenes. This led to a paradoxical outcome, where even as economic conditions deteriorated after 2014, namely due to the Western sanctions after the annexation of Crimea, Putin maintained approval ratings that most Western leaders would envy. This was in part through his appeals to nationalism and his portrayal as a defender of traditional Russian values against Western liberalism. The annexation was seen as one of Putin's major, but hardly the first, moves to return the Russian Federation's territory to its Soviet-era expanse. And this last part is what perhaps shaped Putin's geopolitical doctrine the most. Putin has consistently opposed NATO expansion into former Soviet republics, viewing it as an existential threat to Russian security. His interventions in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in both 2014 and 2022 demonstrated his willingness to use military force to prevent these countries from fully integrating with Western institutions. In a 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference, Putin explicitly rejected the post-Cold War international order, stating, "Russia is a country with a history spanning more than 1,000 years, and it has practically always enjoyed the privilege of pursuing an independent foreign policy. We are not going to change this tradition today." This blatant disregard for previous agreements is one of the main reasons why it's practically impossible to consider Russia an ally or even a possible economic or trading partner. Putin has systematically violated or withdrawn from agreements that constrained its military options, including, number 1, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, where Russia pledged to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for Ukraine giving up Soviet nuclear weapons. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022 shattered this commitment. Number 2, the Helsinki Final Act from 1975 by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was a commitment to keeping the existing borders as stable as possible. Russia's actions in Georgia, namely its invasion of Abkhazia and South Ossetia and subsequent support for separatist movements in these regions, were the start of what seems to be a decades-long attempt to redraw the map surrounding Russia to benefit Putin and his authoritarian worldview. Number 3, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces or INF Treaty, where the US withdrew from this treaty in 2019, citing Russian violations, and Russia formally suspended its participation shortly afterward. Number 4, the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe or CFE Treaty, where Russia suspended its participation in 2007 and formally withdrew on November 7, 2023. Number 5, the Open Skies Treaty, where Russia withdrew in 2021 following the US withdrawal under the Trump administration. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched in February 2022, represents the culmination of Putin's revisionist approach to the post-Soviet world. In his February 21, 2022 address justifying the impending invasion, Putin laid bare his historical grievances and territorial ambitions. Modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, more specifically Bolshevik Communist Russia. This process started practically after the 1917 revolution. He went further on to state that as a result of the Bolshevik policy, the Soviet Ukraine arose, which he claimed could even today be called Lenin's Ukraine. This speech revealed Putin's fundamental rejection of Ukrainian sovereignty and his view that Ukraine's existence as an independent state was a historical aberration. Throughout the war, Putin's speeches have oscillated between claiming limited objectives, denazification and demilitarization, and making more expansive claims about Ukraine's legitimacy as a state. Putin's management of the war, targeting civilian infrastructure, allowing widespread human rights abuses, and making nuclear threats, again demonstrates his willingness to use extreme measures to achieve his geopolitical objectives. The International Criminal Court's issuance of an arrest warrant for Putin in March 2023 on charges of unlawful deportation of children from Ukraine reflects the international community's assessment of his responsibility for war crimes. However, Putin's experience in the KGB might have also hurt his initial approach to the invasion of Ukraine. You see, the actual invasion of Donbass was technically only supposed to be the backdrop for a swift and systematic removal of Ukraine's entire government from power. This would have been accomplished by establishing an air bridge between Moscow and Kyiv, where the Russian military would use the Kyiv-Hostomel airport to directly enter the capital. However, what Putin failed to account for is that the tactic he put into motion was far from the first time such a maneuver was used. The same strategy was deployed by the Soviet Union in then Czechoslovakia in 1968, when the Russian military was dropped into Prague, took over the capital almost bloodlessly, and installed a puppet government. A similar strategy was deployed in Afghanistan in 1979, following the assassination of the existing government leaders. However, in that situation, the Russian military failed to exercise complete control over the country, leading to a decade-long war that caused millions of casualties. And that same tactic was even used against Ukraine itself during the annexation of Crimea in 2014, albeit to the same level of success as in 1968. This was likely due to the element of surprise that Russia maintained. However, there were Ukrainian senior military officials who were old enough to have been in the Soviet Union's army while it still existed and would have likely been taught the very same methods deployed in Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan. Considering that by 2022, Ukraine had the support of US intelligence acting as an early warning system, the country could mount an appropriate defense to the initial strike. This showcased a possible failure of Putin's grand strategy and inability to adapt. You see, Putin's entire geopolitical approach is about control. Ever since his first term in office, Putin has sought to manage every aspect of the country he led. This ostensibly extended to its military efforts. Therefore, when Ukraine, this time backed by the West, failed to play directly into Putin's exact plans, he was possibly caught off guard, leading to a momentary breakdown of momentum, strategy, and logistics of the Russian army. This was enough for the Ukrainian military to repel the initial invasion and receive NATO donations to continue the war. But while Putin's military has floundered, his geopolitical prowess hasn't. It could be argued that Russia is getting exactly what it wants from the war in Ukraine, mainly through Russia's relations with other major world powers such as China and the US. Putin's relationship with Chinese President Xi Jinping represents perhaps his most successful diplomatic initiative. The two leaders have met dozens of times and have developed what appears to be a genuine personal rapport. Their February 2022 joint statement declaring a partnership with no limits just weeks before the invasion of Ukraine signaled that China was all but fully supporting Russia during the invasion. This relationship reflects mutual interests as both leaders reject Western dominance of the international system. Furthermore, both Xi and Putin prioritize regime security over democratic norms, effectively making their countries single-party states. Finally, both leaders benefit economically from their complementary economies, Russia providing resources, China providing manufactured goods and investment. However, the relationship is increasingly asymmetric, with Russia becoming the junior partner as China's economy and global influence far outstrip Russia's. Putin has accepted this imbalance as the price of securing a powerful ally in his confrontation with the West, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have a plan to tackle the West from within. Originally, this was done through the invasion itself, by outright threatening NATO with escalating military response after the initial donations started coming through to Ukraine. Many NATO leaders started to rethink their approach to the conflict. Due to the democratic nature of NATO, a few vital countries failing to pledge their full support meant that vital donations could be delayed significantly, such as in the case of providing F-16 aircraft or even direct monetary support. But Putin had another trump card to play against the West, figuratively speaking. Putin's approach to President Donald Trump demonstrated his tactical flexibility and his ability to identify and exploit perceived weaknesses in adversaries. While maintaining a publicly respectful tone toward Trump, Putin pursued policies that directly undermined US interests, including continued information warfare operations targeting American politics. Their 2018 Helsinki summit, where Trump appeared to accept Putin's denials of election interference over the assessments of US intelligence agencies, represented a diplomatic victory for Putin. It reinforced his image at home as a leader who could stand equal to the American president while advancing Russian interests. During Trump's second term in office, this relationship was fully realized. As Trump has been accused of similar authoritarian leanings to Putin, their worldviews might seem to have more in common to some than might appear. This belief is fed by the Trump administration's abrupt shift from fully supporting Ukraine to having a more reserved stance, particularly in terms of direct economic and military support. Trump has previously been vocal about the US involvement in NATO affairs, particularly regarding other members failing to meet national defense budget quotas. This despite the US being the only member to ever invoke the famous Article 5 of the NATO Charter during the War on Terror, to which many European NATO members, and even Ukraine, a non-member, responded by sending their troops to prolonged operations in the Middle East. With the US being the largest and most economically powerful member of NATO, Putin sowing division in the alliance through Trump presents exactly the type of asymmetric warfare and weaponized ideologies that saw him become Russia's lifelong president in the first place. So where does that leave us? At best, NATO can realize that the only way to reason with Putin is to do exactly the same thing as him, project military power outward. During the Cold War, the US emerged as the world's foremost military, leading to the rest of NATO neglecting their individual militaries. This trend has reversed in recent years both ideologically and economically, with the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Poland making significant strides in modernizing their armies. Furthermore, in the absence of the US spearheading the push towards helping Ukraine, the UK and France have stepped up with innovative strategies, going so far as to create outlines for restructuring NATO's European nuclear defense and deterrence systems, and potentially pledging peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. However, depending on how the war in Ukraine plays out, it might be too little too late, because if Putin wins the war, it only solidifies that his worldview has merit, which can spiral into additional wars for other former Soviet territories. But what do you think? How will NATO deal with Putin? Leave your comments and thanks for watching. Now go and check out the Ukrainian spy master Putin fears most, or click this other video instead.